Billionaire threw the food on the floor. Black Waitress cleaned it up and said a line he'll never forget. The sound of the plate hitting the marble floor echoed through the silent restaurant like a gunshot. 43-year-old Richard Blake stood over the mess, his expensive Italian suit pristine while scrambled eggs and bacon scattered across the pristine tiles below. The other diners had stopped eating, their conversations frozen mid-sentence as they watched the scene unfold. 36-year-old Diane Washington had been working double shifts for 3 months straight, her worn sneakers carrying her between tables with the grace of someone who'd learned to find dignity in service. She'd seen plenty of difficult customers in her 15 years of waitressing, but something about this morning felt different. The weight of exhaustion pressed against her shoulders as she looked down at the destroyed breakfast, then back up at the man who'd thrown it there without a word of explanation. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Where are you watching from today? 2 hours earlier, Diane had kissed her sleeping daughter goodbye and slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness. At 8 years old, Jasmine was already learning to pour her own cereal and catch the school bus alone while her mother worked to keep their small apartment. The diner where Diane worked wasn't fancy, but it attracted a mixed crowd from the business district nearby. Construction workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, office employees meeting for breakfast meetings, and occasionally, wealthy executives who preferred the authentic atmosphere over sterile corporate cafeterias. Richard Blake had built his fortune in real estate development, transforming run-down neighborhoods into gleaming commercial districts. His company's latest project involved purchasing several blocks of older buildings, including the very diner where Diane worked. Though he'd never stepped foot in the establishment before, today he'd chosen it specifically to survey what he considered his future property. The morning had started normally enough. Diane moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups and taking orders with the warm smile that had earned her loyal customers over the years. She'd learned their names, remembered their usual orders, and often asked about their families. To her, each customer was more than just a tip. They were people deserving of respect and kindness, regardless of how they treated her in return. When Richard entered, his presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. His tailored charcoal suit and polished shoes spoke of wealth that few in the diner could comprehend. He chose a corner table, away from the morning rush, and barely glanced up when Diane approached with her notepad ready. "Good morning, sir. What can I get started for you today?" she asked, her voice carrying the same genuine warmth she offered every customer. Richard looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning her uniform and then her face with a detached assessment of someone evaluating a piece of furniture. The usual breakfast plate. Eggs over easy, bacon crisp, wheat toast, coffee, black. And make it quick, I have important business to attend to. Diane nodded pleasantly, despite noticing he hadn't actually looked at the menu. "Absolutely, sir. I'll have that right out for you." As she walked away, Richard returned to his phone, scrolling through emails about the property acquisition. To him, this building and everything in it represented nothing more than square footage and profit margins. The people who worked here, who had built relationships and memories within these walls, were simply obstacles to be relocated when the demolition began. When Diane returned with his breakfast, carefully arranged and steaming hot, Richard barely acknowledged her presence. He took one bite of the eggs, then another, his expression growing increasingly irritated. The bacon wasn't crisp enough. The toast was slightly darker than he preferred. The coffee, though fresh, tasted too strong for his particular palate. Without warning, he pushed the plate away with such force that it slid across the table and crashed to the floor. The sound reverberated through the suddenly quiet diner, and every conversation stopped as heads turned toward their table. The carefully prepared breakfast lay scattered across the clean tiles, a mess of broken ceramic and wasted food that seemed to symbolize something much deeper than a simple meal gone wrong. Diane stared at the broken plate for a long moment, her hand still holding the coffee pot she'd been about to refill. Around them, the diner had fallen completely silent except for the soft jazz playing overhead and the distant sizzle from the kitchen. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, some filled with sympathy, others with the uncomfortable tension that comes from witnessing someone's humiliation. Richard sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, waiting. He'd done this before in expensive restaurants where management would rush to apologize, offer free meals, and treat him like royalty to avoid negative reviews. He expected stammering apologies, maybe tears, certainly subservience. What he didn't expect was for Diane to simply nod once, set down the coffee pot, and walk calmly to the supply closet. She returned with a small broom and dustpan, moving with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the morning. As she knelt beside the table, carefully sweeping up fragments of ceramic and ruined food, Richard felt an unexpected discomfort settle in his chest. Something about her composure, her refusal to react with anger or tears, unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to commanding. The food was terrible. Cold eggs, burnt toast, weak coffee. I shouldn't have to pay for such poor service. Diane continued cleaning, her movements methodical and respectful. She gathered every piece of ceramic, every scrap of food, treating even this humiliating task with a thoroughness that spoke to her character. The other customers began to stir, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others whispering among themselves about the wealthy man who seemed to think money gave him the right to treat people poorly. When she finished cleaning, Diane stood and looked directly at Richard for the first time since the incident began. Her eyes held no anger, no resentment, no fear. Only a kind of sad understanding that seemed to see right through his expensive clothes to something deeper and more vulnerable. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I've been serving food in this diner for 15 years. I've seen people at their best and their worst, on their happiest days and their most difficult ones. I've learned that how someone treats people who can't fight back tells you everything you need to know about who they really are." The words hung in the air like a gentle but firm judgment. Richard felt his chest tighten, a flush of something he couldn't quite identify. Shame, perhaps, or recognition, creeping up his neck. Around them, the diner remained silent, as if everyone was holding their breath. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Diane gathered the dustpan and broom, then looked at him once more. "I'll bring you a fresh breakfast if you'd like to try again, or I can bring you the check if you'd prefer to leave. Either way, I hope your day gets better than it started." With that, she walked away, leaving Richard sitting alone at his table while the weight of her words and the stares of other customers pressed down on him like a physical force. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not what he could do, but who he had become. Richard sat frozen at his table, Diane's words echoing in his mind with an uncomfortable clarity. Around him, the normal sounds of the diner gradually resumed, conversations picking up in hushed tones, the clink of silverware against plates, the gentle hiss of the coffee machine. But he felt isolated, as if sitting in a bubble where only her voice and his racing thoughts existed. He watched Diane return to her other tables, serving each customer with the same genuine warmth she'd initially shown him. An elderly man received his coffee with a grateful smile and a gentle touch on his shoulder. A young mother struggling with a fussy toddler found her meal cut into manageable pieces without having to ask. A construction worker counting coins for his breakfast was told his coffee was "on the house," with a wink that preserved his dignity. Richard's phone buzzed with messages about the property acquisition. His assistant had scheduled the final walkthrough for next week, after which demolition could begin. This building, this diner, these people, all of it would be gone within months, replaced by another gleaming office complex that would bear his company's name and add millions to his portfolio. But as he watched Diane work, something inside him began to crack. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in a small town where his mother had worked 3 jobs to keep food on their table. She'd cleaned offices at night, served lunch at a local cafe during the day, and somehow still found energy to help him with homework and attend his school plays. He remembered how some customers had treated her, with kindness that made her smile for hours, or with cruelty that sent her to bed in tears. When had he forgotten those lessons? When had success and money transformed him into the kind of person his younger self would have despised? Diane appeared beside his table again, this time carrying a fresh cup of coffee and a gentle expression that held no trace of anger or judgment. "I brought you some fresh coffee," she said simply. "The breakfast offer still stands if you're interested." Richard looked up at her. This woman who had every right to ask him to leave, to embarrass him in front of the other customers, to respond to his cruelty with cruelty of her own. Instead, she was offering him coffee and a second chance, treating him with more grace than he'd shown anyone in recent memory. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you being kind to me after what I did?" Diane settled the coffee cup gently on the table, then met his eyes with a wisdom that seemed far older than her 36 years. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment," she said. "And because my daughter is watching how I treat people, even when they don't treat me well. I want her to learn that dignity isn't something someone can take from you, it's something you choose to keep." The mention of her daughter hit Richard like a physical blow. He thought of his own children, now grown and distant, who rarely called unless they needed money. When was the last time he'd been someone they could look up to rather than simply rely on financially? Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Richard reached for his wallet, but not for the reasons Diane might have expected. This wasn't about paying a check anymore. This was about trying to find a way back to the man he used to be. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his wallet, but instead of simply leaving money for the meal, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He actually looked at the person serving him. Really looked. He saw the worn edges of Diane's uniform, carefully maintained but showing signs of countless washings. He noticed the small bandage on her finger, probably from kitchen work, and the way she stood despite what had to be aching feet from hours of service. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been all morning. Diane seemed surprised by the question, but answered honestly. 15 years. Started right after high school, kept working through community college classes, stayed because, well, because this place becomes family after a while. "Family," Richard repeated, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. "And your daughter, how old is she?" 8, Diane said, a genuine smile finally breaking through her professional composure. "Jasmine. She's the reason I do everything I do." Richard nodded slowly, remembering his own children at that age, before his ambition had consumed every evening and weekend, before business trips became more important than school plays and soccer games. "What does she want to be when she grows up?" "A teacher," Diane said with obvious pride. "She wants to help kids who don't have much, like we didn't when I was raising her alone. She says everyone deserves someone who believes in them." The irony wasn't lost on Richard. Here was a child who had less than his own children had ever known, yet she was already thinking about helping others. Meanwhile, his own kids had grown up with every advantage money could buy, but he couldn't remember the last meaningful conversation he'd had with either of them. Richard closed his wallet without taking out money. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found his assistant's number. Diane watched, confused, as he typed a message. "Cancel the demolition permits for the Maple Street project. I want a meeting with the property development team tomorrow morning. We're changing direction." He looked up at Diane, who was still standing beside his table with a puzzled expression. "This diner, do you know it's scheduled to be torn down?" Diane's face went pale. "We heard rumors, but Mr. Henderson, the owner, said it was just talk." "It wasn't just talk. My company bought this building and 4 others on this block. We were planning to demolish everything and build a commercial complex." Richard paused, watching the devastation cross her features. "But we're not going to do that anymore." "I don't understand," Diane whispered. Richard stood up, extending his hand to her, not as an employer to an employee, but as one human being to another. "My name is Richard Blake, and I owe you an apology that's 15 years overdue. Not just for this morning, but for every decision I've made that put profit over people." If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Diane looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face, searching for signs of deception or mockery. What she found instead was something she hadn't expected, genuine remorse and the beginnings of real change. Slowly, she reached out and shook his hand, feeling the weight of a moment that would reshape both their futures. 3 months later, Diane arrived at work to find the diner buzzing with an energy she hadn't felt in years. The building had been renovated from top to bottom. New equipment in the kitchen, fresh paint on the walls, comfortable booths replacing the worn-out seating. But more importantly, the heart of the place remained unchanged. The same familiar faces filled the tables, the same warmth filled the air, and the same sense of community that had always made this more than just a restaurant continued to thrive. Richard had kept his word. Instead of demolishing the building, his company had purchased it outright and invested in its restoration. The diner was now part of a community development project that included affordable housing units above the restaurant and small business spaces that gave local entrepreneurs a chance to grow. Diane had been promoted to manager, with a salary that finally allowed her to provide for Jasmine without working double shifts. But the most significant change wasn't in the building or the business model. It was in the man who now sat at table 7 every Tuesday morning, reading the newspaper and chatting with other customers like he'd been part of the community for years. Richard's transformation hadn't been instant or easy. Learning to see people as individuals rather than obstacles required daily effort and constant self-reflection. He'd started volunteering at local schools, reading to children who reminded him of the boy he used to be before success hardened his heart. He'd reached out to his own children, beginning the slow process of rebuilding relationships that money alone couldn't repair. On this particular Tuesday morning, Richard finished his breakfast, eggs over easy, bacon crisp, wheat toast, prepared exactly the way he liked but served with genuine care, and approached the counter where Diane was organizing receipts. "How's Jasmine's science project coming along?" he asked. Something that would have been unthinkable months ago when he couldn't even be bothered to learn his server's name. "She's building a model of sustainable housing," Diane smiled. "Says she got the idea from that nice man who visits Mama's work. She wants to design homes that help families stay together in their communities instead of being pushed out." Richard felt that familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was pride rather than shame. Smart girl. She's going to change the world. "She already has," Diane said quietly, looking directly at him. "Just by being herself, she changed yours." As Richard prepared to leave, he placed his usual tip on the counter. But it was accompanied by something else. A small envelope containing information about the scholarship fund his company had established for children of service industry workers, with Jasmine Washington listed as the first recipient. "Everyone deserves someone who believes in them," he said, echoing the words Diane had shared about her daughter months ago. Walking out into the morning sunlight, Richard understood something his wealth had never taught him. True success wasn't measured in buildings constructed or profits accumulated, but in lives touched and dignity restored. Sometimes the most profound lessons came from the people you least expected, delivered not with force but with grace, in moments when you thought no one was watching. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of redemption and second chances.